Security. Get her out of here. The words didn't echo, they cut, sharp and certain, slicing through the open office floor at exactly 9:12 a.m., when the coffee was still warm and the illusion of professionalism hadn't yet cracked. Heads lifted in slow unison. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Fingers hovered above keyboards like the room itself had forgotten how to move. And at the center of it all stood a woman who didn't belong, at least that's what they thought. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now back to Danielle Brooks. She didn't flinch. Not when Karen Whitmore's heels struck the marble with purpose. Not when the words, "You don't belong here," lingered in the air like policy instead of opinion. Danielle stood still, shoulders relaxed, hands resting lightly at her sides, dressed in a fitted charcoal blazer over a plain white top, dark jeans, and low black heels that made no sound when she walked in just minutes earlier. No badge clipped her collar. No assistant trailing behind. No signal that she held any weight in this place. And that was exactly the problem. Karen stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, chin tilted slightly upward as if authority lived somewhere above her eyeline. "This floor is restricted," she said, her tone measured but edged with something colder. "Executives only." A few employees glanced between them, subtle but curious. One leaned back in his chair. Another slowly slid her headset off, eyes narrowing just enough to signal interest. Danielle said nothing. She simply looked at Karen the way someone studies a pattern they've seen before. Because she had. At 22, in a conference room where her ideas were credited to someone else. At 27, when a client asked if she was part of the support staff. At 35, when a deal nearly collapsed because someone assumed she didn't have final authority. Same look, different room. Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice like that made it more legitimate. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said. "Who are you here to see?" Still nothing. Not defiance. Not confusion. Just silence that refused to explain itself. Across the room, a young intern named Liam Carter glanced down at his tablet, scrolling through the internal directory after catching Danielle's face in his peripheral vision. Something didn't sit right. The name felt familiar, like a headline half-remembered. He looked up again, longer this time. Karen exhaled sharply, clearly done with the lack of response. "Security," she called, not turning her head, just raising her voice enough for it to carry. "We have someone on the floor who shouldn't be here." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the desks. Someone whispered, "She doesn't even have a badge." Another added, "Probably walked in behind someone." Danielle's eyes shifted, just slightly, taking in the room. The glass walls. The polished floors. The people who had already decided who she was without a single fact. Karen reached out then. Not aggressive, not forceful, but certain, her fingers brushing Danielle's shoulder as if guiding her out was already a done deal. And that was the moment something changed. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. Danielle turned her head just enough to meet Karen's eyes directly, and for the first time, there was something different there. Not anger, not embarrassment, just clarity. The kind that comes right before everything flips. Across the office, a notification chimed. Then another. Liam's tablet froze for half a second before refreshing. His eyes widened. He looked back up at Danielle, then back down again, his grip tightening slightly, as if he wasn't sure he was reading it right. Karen didn't notice. She was still talking, still certain. "You can't just walk into a place like this and expect." Another chime cut her off, louder this time, followed by a third. Then a fourth. Heads began to turn toward their screens. And somewhere, quietly, without announcement or warning, something had just been set in motion. The first chime was easy to ignore. Offices like this lived on notifications. Emails, calendar reminders, system pings. Background noise disguised as productivity. But the second one landed differently. Louder. Sharper. Heads lifted again, this time not out of curiosity, but confusion. Karen paused mid-sentence, her hand still hovering near Danielle's shoulder, her authority hanging in the air, without a place to land. "What is that?" someone muttered from the far row. A third chime cut through, then a fourth, each one stacking tension on top of the last like something was building behind the scenes, something no one in the room had been invited to understand. Danielle did not move. She did not reach for a phone. She did not check a screen. She simply stood there, as if the room would eventually catch up to her pace instead of the other way around. Liam's eyes stayed locked on his tablet. His thumb hovered over the glass, scrolling back up, then down again, as if the name he saw refused to stay where it was supposed to be. His heartbeat picked up, not from fear but from recognition that arrived too late to stop anything. He looked up at Danielle again, longer this time, searching her face for confirmation of something he was not yet brave enough to say out loud. Karen finally dropped her hand, turning halfway toward the nearest desk. "Everyone stay focused," she said, her voice tighter now, less composed than before. "It is probably a system update," but the room did not return to normal. It leaned further into the disruption. Screens flickered. A few employees clicked into their inboxes, brows tightening as identical subject lines appeared across monitors at the same time. No sender name, just a company-wide priority tag. One of the senior analysts, a man in his 50s named Richard Hale, adjusted his glasses and opened the message. His posture changed almost instantly. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that the woman beside him noticed. "What is it?" she whispered. Richard did not answer right away. He just read. Then read again. Across the room, another employee inhaled sharply. Someone else leaned closer to their screen, lips parting without words. The energy shifted from annoyance to something heavier, something uncertain. Karen sensed it. She straightened, turning fully now, scanning the room like control was something she could pull back if she moved fast enough. "If anyone is having a system issue, contact IT," she said, louder this time. But no one responded. No one acknowledged her. Because whatever they were reading was not a glitch. It was deliberate. Liam stood up halfway from his chair before stopping himself, unsure if he should speak or stay silent. His eyes flicked between Karen and Danielle, then back to the message on his tablet. The name was there. Clear. Undeniable. Danielle Brooks. Not in a visitor log. Not in a meeting request. In the highest access tier the system had. His throat tightened. This is not a mistake, he thought, but the words stayed inside him. Karen took a step back toward Danielle, trying to reclaim the moment she had lost. "I do not know what kind of distraction you think this is," she said, lowering her voice again, forcing calm where it no longer existed, "but it is not going to work." Danielle's gaze remained steady, unshaken by the shift in tone. She had seen this part before, too. The moment when certainty starts to crack, but pride refuses to admit it. Somewhere near the center of the floor, the large digital display mounted on the glass wall flickered once. Then again. A low hum followed, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations stopped completely now. Every eye moved toward the screen as it powered on without input, without announcement, without permission. Karen turned with them, her expression tightening for the first time, not in anger, but in something closer to doubt. The screen went black for half a second. Then white. Bright. Clean. Waiting. And in that pause, in that single suspended breath where no one spoke and no one moved, Danielle Brooks finally shifted her weight forward just slightly, as if she had been waiting for this exact second all along. The white screen did not stay empty for long. A single line of text appeared first, centered, clean, undeniable, as if it had always belonged there waiting to be seen. Then it expanded. Bold letters, sharp contrast. Executive access confirmed. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, but immediate. Chairs shifted. Someone whispered, "What does that mean?" Another voice, quieter. "That is not a standard alert." Karen's posture stiffened. Her arms, once confidently crossed, lowered just slightly as her eyes locked onto the display. "This is an error," she said quickly, almost reflexively, as if saying it out loud could make it true. But the system did not respond to her voice. It continued. The next line appeared beneath the first, slower this time, as if the moment itself wanted to stretch. Danielle Brooks. The name settled into the room like weight. Not everyone reacted at once. Some blinked. Some leaned closer. But Liam did not move at all. His screen matched the display. Same name. Same access level. His chest tightened as the realization landed fully now, no longer a suspicion but a fact he could not ignore. Across the floor, Richard Hale stood up halfway from his chair, his eyes moving from the screen to Danielle, then back again. He had been with the company long enough to recognize internal systems that did not make mistakes like this. Not at this level. Not with this kind of visibility. Karen shook her head once, sharply, as if clearing it. "No," she said under her breath, then louder. "No, that is not possible." She turned back to Danielle, searching her face for something that would bring the situation back under her control. An explanation. A crack. Anything. But Danielle did not offer it. She did not rush to speak. She did not point at the screen. She simply stood there, calm, grounded, like the room was finally catching up to a truth she had never needed to announce. The display shifted again. A soft transition, almost seamless. The company logo appeared, followed by a line most employees had only ever seen in internal presentations, never in real time, never connected to a person standing 10 feet away. Chief Executive Officer. The silence that followed was complete. Not a single whisper. Not a single movement. Even the hum of the building seemed to fade beneath the weight of what those words meant in that exact moment. Karen's face changed. Not dramatically, not in a way she could hide quickly, but enough. The certainty was gone. In its place, something unfamiliar. Doubt. Real, visible doubt. Her eyes flicked once more to the screen, then back to Danielle, then back again, as if hoping the title would rearrange itself into something less permanent. It did not. Liam finally spoke, his voice low, almost involuntary. "That is her." He did not realize he had said it out loud until the woman beside him turned. But it was enough. The room heard it. The connection snapped into place for everyone at once. Danielle Brooks. Not a visitor. Not a mistake. The highest authority in the building. Standing in front of them. Unannounced. Unprotected by title or introduction. Karen took a small step back. It was subtle, but it broke the illusion she had been holding on to. Her shoulders dropped just slightly, the posture of command replaced by something uncertain, something reactive. "If this is some kind of system glitch," she started again, but the sentence did not finish. Because even she could hear it now. It did not sound convincing anymore. Danielle's eyes met hers fully for the first time since the screen came alive. Not confrontational. Not raised. Just steady. The kind of look that did not need volume to carry weight. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even, measured in a way that made every word land exactly where it was meant to. "You said I did not belong here." No one interrupted. No one moved. The sentence hung in the air, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Danielle took one small step forward, closing the space Karen had created when she stepped back, not aggressively, not quickly, just enough to shift the balance completely. Now you know why that matters. No one rushed to speak after that. The silence was no longer confusion. It was recognition catching up with consequence. Karen's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if every response she had prepared no longer fit the moment she was standing in. Her eyes moved across the room, searching for support, for someone to validate what she had just said minutes ago, but no one stepped forward. Not now. Not with the screen still glowing behind Danielle, not with the title still visible, not with the weight of what had just been revealed settling into every corner of the office. Danielle did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She let the silence do its work. She let every person in that room sit with what they had seen, what they had heard, and more importantly, what they had assumed. Karen finally tried again, her tone shifting, softer now, less certain. "If there's been a misunderstanding," she said carefully, choosing each word as if it might rebuild something that had already collapsed, "we can clarify the situation privately." The phrasing was controlled, but the shift was obvious. Just minutes ago, There had been no offer of privacy. No respect for dignity. Only assumption. Only dismissal. Danielle's gaze did not move. There was no misunderstanding, she replied, calm, direct, leaving no space for reinterpretation. The words landed clean. Across the room, Richard exhaled slowly, his posture straightening as if something inside him had realigned. He glanced at Karen, then back to Danielle, then to the rest of the team, as if silently asking a question none of them were ready to answer out loud. Liam remained standing now, no longer halfway in his chair, his tablet forgotten in his hand. His eyes moved between the two women, absorbing every detail, every shift in tone, every change in posture. This was not just a moment. It was a turning point, and he could feel it. Karen swallowed, the confidence that once filled her voice now replaced with careful restraint. "We were following protocol," she said, quieter now, as if the word itself could protect her. "Restricted floor.
No buy.
No prior notice." Danielle tilted her head just slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of the logic that had been used against her. "Protocol," she repeated, her tone even, almost reflective. "That is an interesting word." She took another small step forward, not closing distance aggressively, but enough to shift the dynamic further, enough to make it clear that she was no longer being moved. The room adjusted with her. Eyes followed. Breaths held. "Tell me," Danielle continued, her voice steady, "when you looked at me, before you said anything, before you asked a question, before you called security, what part of your protocol told you I did not belong?"
The
question did not come with accusation. It came with precision. And that made it heavier. Karen's expression tightened. She opened her mouth, searching for an answer that would hold under the weight of that question, but nothing came out. Because there was no policy for that moment.
no guideline.
No written rule that explained the decision she had made within seconds of seeing Danielle. Around them, the room shifted again. Not physically, not loudly, but internally. Employees who had stayed quiet before now looked at Karen differently. Not as authority, not as certainty, but as someone being asked a question they could not answer. Liam finally spoke again, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "She did not even get a chance to explain," he said, more to the room than to anyone specific. It was not defiant. It was factual. And it landed. Karen's eyes flicked toward him, surprised, almost caught off guard that someone had stepped out of silence. But the shift had already begun. Danielle did not look away from Karen. "You did not ask who I was," she said. "You decided." Another pause. Another breath held across the room. "And decisions like that," Danielle added, just as calm as before, "do not come from protocol." The words settled deeper than anything else she had said. Because they did not attack. They revealed. And in that moment, the room understood something that had nothing to do with titles or access levels. This was never about a badge. This was about judgment. And now that judgment was standing in full view, with nowhere left to hide. The room did not recover from that question. It shifted deeper into itself, like something had been exposed that could not be unseen. Karen stood there, shoulders slightly drawn in now, her posture no longer commanding the space but reacting to it. For the first time since she had spoken, she did not have the next line ready. Danielle let the silence stretch, not as pressure, but as clarity. Because this was the part most people tried to rush past. The moment where truth sat in the open and demanded to be acknowledged. Across the office, a few employees looked down at their desks, not because they had something to do, but because eye contact suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Others kept watching, unable to look away, caught between discomfort and realization. Richard took a slow step forward from his desk, not toward Danielle, not toward Karen, but into the space between observation and accountability. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, but carried the weight of experience. "She is right," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that no one could pretend not to hear it. Karen turned toward him, surprised, almost searching for support she had expected, but did not receive. "Richard, this is not," she started, but he did not let her finish. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just firmly. "This is exactly what it is," he replied. The interruption was not about volume. It was about direction. And it shifted the room again. Liam nodded slightly, almost instinctively, as if the words confirmed what he had already been thinking but had not yet found the courage to say. Karen's eyes moved between them, her control over the narrative slipping in quiet, visible ways. Danielle watched it happen without satisfaction, without anger, just observation, because she had seen this pattern before too. The moment when the room stops following the loudest voice and starts listening to the truth instead. Karen exhaled slowly, her tone changing again, now more defensive than authoritative. "We cannot ignore security protocols," she said, trying to anchor herself to something structured, something official. "We have to protect this space." Danielle nodded once, not dismissing the point, but not accepting it as an explanation either. "Protect it from what?" she asked, her voice still calm, still steady, but sharper now in its precision. "From someone standing quietly, asking for nothing, disturbing no one?" The question landed differently than the last one. It did not just expose a decision. It exposed the fear behind it. Karen hesitated. Not long, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for the room to notice. Enough for the gap between what she said and what she did to become impossible to ignore. A woman near the back of the office, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. Up, her voice cautious but honest. "She did not do anything," she said. It was simple, unpolished, but it carried weight because it came from someone who had nothing to gain by saying it. Karen looked at her, then away, as if acknowledging that point would only deepen what was already unfolding. Danielle's gaze softened slightly, not toward Karen, but toward the room itself. Because this was no longer just about one interaction. It was about a pattern that everyone in that space had either seen, experienced, or participated in, whether they admitted it or not. "This is how it starts," Danielle said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Not with policy. Not with rules. With assumption. The word settled into the room differently than anything else. Assumption. It did not shout. It did not accuse. It explained. Liam lowered his tablet completely now, no longer needing it. The truth was not on the screen anymore. It was in the room. Karen's voice, when it returned, was quieter than it had ever been. "That was not my intention," she said. Danielle held her gaze, steady, unblinking. "Intention does not change impact," she replied. No one spoke after that. Because there was nothing left to argue. The structure Karen had tried to stand on had dissolved. The explanation had been removed. And what remained was something much harder to defend. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A choice. And now that choice was visible to everyone. The silence that followed did not break the tension. It deepened it. The kind of silence that forces reflection, not escape. Karen stood still, but something in her had shifted completely now. The confidence that once drove every word had been replaced with something quieter, something uncertain. Not because she had been challenged loudly, but because she had been understood clearly. And that was harder to defend against. Danielle did not move right away. She let the moment settle, let every person in that room sit with what had just been said, not as a confrontation, but as a realization. Because this was never about raising her voice. It was about raising awareness in a room that had been too comfortable making decisions without it. Across the office, Richard folded his arms, not in defiance, but in thought, his gaze fixed somewhere between Danielle and Karen, as if recalibrating everything he had just witnessed. Liam shifted his weight slightly, his posture more upright now, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting for direction. He had already chosen where he stood, even if he had not said it again out loud. Karen finally inhaled slowly, her voice returning, but without the edge it once carried. "We can correct this," she said, carefully, almost cautiously. "We can address the situation and move forward." The words sounded structured, familiar, like something practiced in meetings and internal reports. But in this moment, they felt out of place. Because nothing about what had just happened was procedural. Danielle's eyes remained steady, her tone calm but firmer now, anchored in something deeper than the moment itself. "Move forward," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of those words. Then she shook her head just once. You do not move forward from something you have not acknowledged. The room felt that, not as pressure, as truth. Karen's gaze dropped briefly, then lifted again, searching for ground that no longer held. I said it was not my intention, she replied, quieter than before. Danielle nodded slightly, not dismissing the statement, but not accepting it as resolution.
And I heard you, she said.
But intention is where it starts. Impact is where it ends. The words did not rise. They did not push. They settled, deliberate and final. Somewhere behind them, another notification sounded, softer this time, but it drew attention again. Screens updated. A new message appeared across the system, not loud, not dramatic, but official. Internal review initiated. Employee conduct flagged for executive audit. The language was neutral. The implication was not. Karen saw it. Her expression tightened, not in panic, but in realization. This was no longer contained within this room. This was now part of the structure she had relied on. The same system she had invoked moments ago without question was now responding in a way she could not control. Danielle glanced briefly toward the display, then back to Karen, her expression unchanged. She did not need to point at it. The room had already seen. Richard exhaled again, slower this time, his voice low but clear. This is bigger than a single moment, he said. No one disagreed, because they could feel it. The shift was not just an authority. It was an awareness. The room was no longer passive. It was awake. Karen stood there, her hands now loosely at her sides, no longer directing, no longer deciding. For the first time, she was listening, not to respond, but to understand. Danielle took one final step forward, not to dominate the space, but to define it. Her voice, when it came again, was steady, unwavering, carrying a weight that did not need volume. This company does not fail because of one decision, she said. It fails when those decisions go unexamined. The words landed across every desk, every screen, every person standing there. Because it was not just about what had happened, it was about what had been allowed to happen before, and what would no longer be ignored after this moment. The office did not return to normal. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted. Not in policy, not in structure, in perspective. And once that changes, everything else follows. No one returned to their desks after that. Not because they were told to stay, but because something in the room had shifted beyond routine. The usual rhythm of clicking keyboards and quiet conversations had disappeared, replaced by a stillness that demanded attention. Karen remained where she stood, but the space around her felt different now, not centered on her, not guided by her. For the first time, she was no longer the one shaping the moment. She was inside it. Danielle let the silence hold a few seconds longer, not to create tension, but to give it meaning. Because moments like this were often rushed past, softened, diluted. And that was how nothing changed. She did not allow that here. Across the office, Liam took a slow breath and stepped forward fully now, no longer halfway committed, no longer uncertain about whether he should speak. His voice was steady, not loud, but clear. This is not
new, he said.
The words did not accuse. They revealed. A few heads turned toward him, surprised, but no one interrupted, because they knew. Maybe not out loud, maybe not formally, but they knew. Karen looked at him, her expression tightening again, not with authority, but with discomfort. Be careful, she said quietly, almost instinctively, as if trying to regain some control over the direction of the conversation. But Liam did not step back. Not this time. I am being careful, he replied, just as calm. That is why I am saying it now. The room absorbed that exchange differently than anything before. This was no longer a single voice. It was shifting into something collective. Richard nodded once, slowly, his gaze still forward.
He is right, he added.
We have seen versions of this before. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest. And honesty, in that moment, carried more weight than any authority Karen had tried to hold. Danielle watched them both, not with surprise, but with recognition. This was the turning point she understood well.
Not when power speaks.
When others begin to. Karen exhaled, her composure thinning, not breaking, but no longer steady. If there are concerns, she said, choosing her words carefully again, there are formal channels to address them. The statement sounded familiar, structured,
Safe.
but it no longer held the same power, because what had happened did not begin in a formal channel. It began in a moment of assumption. Danielle shifted her gaze briefly across the room, taking in the faces, the posture, the awareness settling into each person differently. Then she looked back at Karen. Formal channels exist after something happens, she said calmly. Leadership exists before it does. The distinction landed.
Clean.
Undeniable. Karen did not respond right away. She could not, because the framework she had relied on was no longer enough to carry the weight of the moment. Another screen updated quietly in the background, the internal system continuing its process without interruption. Review in progress. Documentation captured.
It was no longer about perception.
It was recorded. Real.
Permanent.
A woman near the front desk, who had stayed silent until now, slowly stood. Her voice was softer than the others, but it carried because of when she chose to speak. I stayed quiet before, she admitted, because I thought it was not my place. The room shifted again, more subtly this time, but deeper. Danielle turned her head slightly toward her, acknowledging without interrupting. The woman continued, finding her footing as she spoke. But it is our place, she said. If we see it. No one dismissed her. No one redirected. Because that was the truth that had been missing. Not policy. Not protocol. Responsibility. Karen's shoulders lowered just slightly, not in defeat, but in realization. The moment was no longer something she could contain or redirect. It had moved beyond her. Danielle stepped forward one final time, not to claim space, but to define it with clarity that left no confusion behind. Her voice remained steady, grounded, unwavering. This is not about removing one mistake, she said. It is about understanding why it was made. The words settled across the room, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Because what had been exposed here was not an isolated action. It was a pattern. And patterns do not change with silence. They change when they are seen. And now, in that office, they were. The room held on to that truth like it was something fragile, something that could slip away if anyone spoke too quickly or tried to soften it. But no one rushed in this time. No one tried to redirect the moment back into something comfortable, because comfort was what allowed it to happen in the first place. Danielle stood still, but her presence now carried something different. Not just authority.
Clarity.
The kind that did not demand attention, but commanded it anyway. Karen shifted her weight slightly, her heels no longer striking the floor with confidence, but settling into place, as if even movement required thought now. She looked around the office again, but this time it was not to gather support. It was to understand what had changed. And the answer was simple. The room was no longer neutral. It had taken a position.
Not loudly.
Not dramatically. But unmistakably. Liam lowered his gaze. For a moment, not out of hesitation, but reflection. Then he spoke again, more grounded this time. I used to think moments like this were isolated, he said. Like they just happened randomly. He paused briefly, then shook his head. But they do not. A few people nodded. Quietly, almost instinctively, because they recognized that pattern now. Not as observers. As participants. Karen listened, her expression tightening again, but not in resistance. In realization, because every word being said was not an attack. It was a mirror, and it was showing something she could not ignore anymore. Danielle watched her carefully, not with judgment, but with intention. This was not about breaking someone down. It was about making something visible. It repeats, Danielle said calmly, picking up where the thought had left off. In different ways, in different rooms, but it repeats. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The truth carried itself. Richard took a slow step closer now, not to Danielle, not to Karen, but to the center of the space where the conversation had settled. His voice was steady, shaped by years of watching patterns without naming them. And we normalize it, he added. We call it policy. We call it caution. We call it protecting the environment. He paused, then looked directly at Karen. But it is none of those things when it is based on assumption. The words landed clean. There was no way around them. Karen's shoulders dropped slightly, the last remnants of her earlier certainty fading into something quieter, something more honest. She looked at Danielle again, but this time without the filter she had applied before. Without the quick judgment. Without the immediate conclusion. And in that moment, she saw what she had missed. Not just a title, a presence, a composure that had never once reacted the way she expected it to. Danielle did not speak right away. She let that realization settle fully. Because this was the moment that mattered. Not the reveal. Not the authority. The understanding. You looked at me, Danielle said softly, and decided the outcome before the interaction even began. Karen did not interrupt. She could not. Because that was exactly what had happened. And now it was clear. Not just to Danielle. To everyone. The woman near the front who had spoken earlier stepped forward slightly, her voice steadier now. We do that more than we admit, she said. We decide first, then we justify it after. A quiet agreement moved through the room. Not spoken.
Felt.
Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that statement. That is how bias works, she said. It does not ask for permission. It shows up in decisions that feel normal until someone stops and questions them. Karen exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering for a moment before lifting again. There was no defense left in her posture now. Only recognition. I see that, she said quietly. The words were simple, but they were different from anything she had said before. Because they were not an explanation. They were an acknowledgement. And that changed everything. Danielle held her gaze, steady, but not unforgiving. Because this was not about winning a moment. It was about changing what came after it. Seeing it is the first step, Danielle replied. What you do after that is what defines you. The room absorbed that in silence. Because it was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. And for the first time since the moment began, the focus was no longer on exposure. It was on accountability. The room did not return to its previous state because there was no previous state to return to. What had been revealed could not be folded back into routine or buried under another meeting, another deadline, another quiet assumption. It stayed in the air, present, undeniable. Danielle watched the shift settle across every face, not looking for reaction, not measuring loyalty, but observing understanding. Because this was the moment where change either took root or quietly disappeared later. Karen stood still, her posture no longer defensive, no longer guarded, but not yet resolved either. She was somewhere in between, caught in the space where awareness begins but action has not yet followed. Her eyes moved briefly toward the floor, then back up to Danielle, as if she was recalibrating how to even stand in this new
reality.
What happens now? She asked finally, her voice lower than before, not carrying authority, not demanding direction, but seeking it. The question did not feel procedural. It felt personal. Danielle held her gaze for a moment, then glanced around the room, taking in the people who had spoken, the ones who had stayed silent, and the ones who were still processing everything in between. Now, she said calmly, we do not rush past this. The words landed differently than expected. Not as a command, as a pause. Richard nodded slightly, understanding immediately. This was not about fixing optics. It was about facing reality. Liam shifted his stance, more grounded now, no longer uncertain, his voice quieter but firm when he added, if we move on too quickly, nothing actually changes. No one challenged that. Because they had all seen it before. Moments like this reduced to a note, a meeting, a statement, then forgotten. Danielle turned back to Karen, her tone steady, precise. Accountability is not a statement, she said. It is a process. Karen absorbed that slowly. Not resisting. Not deflecting. Just listening. Because for the first time, she understood that this was not something she could talk her way through. It was something she had to move through. The system behind them updated again, the internal audit continuing its quiet progression. Documentation time-stamped. Witness accounts flagged. It was no longer abstract. It was structured. And that structure was now working in a direction Karen had not anticipated when she first invoked protocol. The same system that once reinforced her authority was now examining it. A few employees glanced at their screens again, not out of curiosity this time, but awareness. They understood that what they had witnessed was not just a moment. It was now part of record. Danielle stepped slightly to the side, no longer centered in the confrontation, but still holding the presence that defined it. "This is not about removing you from a position in this moment," she said, her voice calm but clear. "It is about understanding whether you can lead differently after this one." The statement shifted the tension again. It was not immediate punishment. It was something more complex. Responsibility. Karen's eyes widened just slightly, not in relief, but in realization of what that meant. This was not something that would end quickly. It would require reflection, change, consistency. Things that could not be performed in a single moment. Richard looked toward Danielle, then back to Karen, his voice steady when he added, "Leadership is not tested when everything is comfortable. It is tested right here."
The room felt that.
Because this was the test. Not just for Karen. For everyone. The woman near the front who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, her voice softer now but certain. "We all have to look at this," she said. "Not just her." Danielle acknowledged that with a slight nod. Because that was the truth that made the moment bigger than any one person. "This is not an isolated failure," Danielle said. "It is a shared environment that allowed it." The words did not accuse. They included. And that made them harder to ignore. Karen took a slow breath, her shoulders settling, her voice quiet but clear when she finally spoke again. "Then I need to understand it fully," she said. Danielle held her gaze, steady, unwavering. "Then start by not defending it," she replied. No one moved. No one spoke. Because that was the beginning. Not of resolution, but of change. And this time, no one looked away. Karen did not respond immediately after that. Not because she did not hear the instruction, but because she understood what it required. Not a quick apology. Not a controlled statement. Something deeper. Something harder. The kind of shift that could not be performed in front of an audience and then forgotten once the room cleared. She stood there, the weight of every earlier word now settling into place, her posture no longer shaped by authority, but by awareness. Danielle did not interrupt that silence. She allowed it to exist fully, because this was the space where change either began or quietly died. Across the room, the energy had transformed again, but this time it was steadier, less reactive, more deliberate. Employees were no longer just watching. They were thinking,
Processing.
measuring their own past moments against what they had just witnessed. Richard leaned slightly against the edge of a desk, his arms relaxed, his expression thoughtful rather than tense. He was not looking at Karen anymore. He was looking at the room, as if recognizing that what had been exposed did not belong to one person alone. Liam remained standing, his tablet now resting at his side, forgotten. He was not searching for information anymore. He had already found it. The truth was no longer hidden in data. It was visible in behavior. Karen finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady, different from before in a way that no one could miss. "Then I need to start with what I did," she said. The room did not react loudly, but it shifted, because that was the first real step. Not explanation. Not justification. Ownership. Danielle held her gaze, watching closely, not for perfection, but for sincerity. Karen took a slow breath, her eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to Danielle. "I made a decision based on how I perceived you," she continued, before asking a single question. The words were simple, but they carried weight because they were no longer avoiding the truth. They were naming it. A quiet stillness followed, not uncomfortable this time, but attentive. Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the step without interrupting its importance. Karen continued, her voice gaining clarity as she moved through it. "And I framed that decision as protocol," she added. "When it was not." Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if something in the room had just aligned. Liam glanced toward Danielle, then back to Karen, his expression no longer uncertain, but focused. This was what accountability looked like when it was real. Danielle spoke again, her tone calm but grounded in expectation. "And what does that mean for how you lead from this point forward?" she asked. The question did not accuse. It directed.
Karen did not hesitate this time.
Not because the answer was easy, but because she understood what was being asked. "It means I do not rely on assumption," she said. "Not in moments like this. Not in any moment." She paused briefly, then added, "It means I question my own first reaction before I act on it." The room absorbed that differently than anything before. Not as defense, as commitment. Danielle watched her carefully, measuring not the words alone, but the shift behind them. Because this was the line between awareness and action. "And it means," Karen continued, her voice steadier now, "that I create space for others to question me when I do not." That landed deeper than the rest, because it extended accountability beyond herself. It opened the door for change to exist beyond a single moment. The woman near the front who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That is how it changes," she said quietly. "When it is not just one person carrying it." Danielle acknowledged that with a slight nod, then looked back at Karen. "Understanding is not the finish line," she said. "It is the starting point." Karen met her gaze, this time without hesitation. "Then I start here," she replied. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be, because the room could feel the difference between what had been said earlier and what was being said now. One was control. The other was change. The system behind them continued its quiet process, documenting, recording, ensuring that this moment would not disappear into memory alone.
But the real shift was not in the system.
It was in the room, in the people, in the awareness that had been forced into the open and could not be ignored again. Danielle took a small step back, not disengaging, but allowing the space to breathe differently now. The confrontation had become something else. Not a collapse. A turning point. And everyone standing there knew it. The room did not erupt after Karen's words. It did not need to. The shift was quieter than that, deeper than reaction, more permanent than applause. It settled into posture, into eye contact, into the way people held themselves now that they had seen something they could not unsee. Danielle watched the room carefully, not measuring approval, not seeking validation, but observing whether the moment had truly landed. Because words alone did not change culture. What followed them did. Karen remained where she stood, but she no longer looked like someone holding a position. She looked like someone standing inside a responsibility she had just acknowledged. And that difference was everything. Across the office, a few employees slowly returned to their desks, not out of habit, but out of a new awareness that work would continue, but not the same way it had before. Richard moved first, not to leave the moment behind, but to carry it with him. He sat down, but his posture remained upright, his attention still anchored in what had just unfolded. Liam followed, placing his tablet on the desk without looking at it, his thoughts clearly somewhere else, replaying the sequence, understanding its weight beyond the moment itself. Danielle took a slow breath, her gaze moving across the space one more time, not scanning for reaction, but for recognition. She saw it, in small ways, in subtle shifts, in the absence of dismissal. That was enough for now. She stepped forward slightly, not to reclaim authority, but to define the next phase. Her voice, when it came, was calm, grounded, but carried a clarity that left no ambiguity. "This moment does not end when we go back to our desks," she said. No one spoke. No one interrupted, because they understood. "It follows every decision made after this," she continued. "Every interaction, every assumption." The words moved through the room differently now, not as correction, as expectation. Karen nodded once, slowly, her expression steady, not defensive, not uncertain, but aware. Then it needs to be built into how we operate, she said. The statement was not reactive. It was intentional. Danielle held her gaze, acknowledging the direction without softening the weight behind it. Not built, she replied. Rebuilt. That distinction landed, because it meant something deeper than adjustment. It meant change at the foundation. Richard looked up from his desk, his voice calm but firm. Then we start with transparency, he said. Not just in outcomes. In process. Liam nodded slightly, adding, and in how decisions are made before they become actions. The room absorbed those additions, not as suggestions, but as necessary steps.
Danielle listened, allowing
the room to contribute because this was no longer about a single voice directing change. It was about a collective understanding shaping it. The woman near the front who had spoken earlier took a small step forward again, her voice steady now, no hesitation left. And accountability cannot just exist after something goes wrong, she said. It has to exist in the moment, when something feels off. Danielle nodded once, affirming the point. Exactly, she said. Because the cost of waiting is what you saw today. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. They carried truth. Karen took a breath, her shoulders settling into a new kind of steadiness. Then we formalize it, she said. Clear expectations. Open challenge.
No assumptions unchecked.
Danielle watched her carefully, not for performance, but for consistency between what was said and what would follow. Because that was where real change lived. And we measure it, Danielle added. Not by what is written, by what is practiced. The room understood that immediately, because they had just witnessed the difference between the two. The system behind them continued its quiet operation, logging, documenting, preserving the moment in a way that ensured it would not fade. But the real record was not digital. It was human. It was in the way each person now understood their role differently. Danielle stepped back slightly, allowing the room to settle into this new alignment. The tension had transformed. It was no longer about confrontation. It was about direction. And for the first time since the moment began, there was something else in the air. Not discomfort. Not uncertainty. Clarity. And with it, responsibility that no one in that room could ignore anymore. The room did not disperse immediately, even as people slowly returned to their desks. Something held them there, not physically, but mentally, as if leaving too quickly would mean missing the point of what had just happened. Danielle remained where she was, no longer at the center of confrontation, but still at the center of clarity. She watched as the space began to function again, but differently now. Conversations were quieter, more intentional. Movements were slower, more aware. Even the way people sat at their desks carried a subtle shift, like they understood that how they showed up mattered more than they had realized before. Karen did not move right away. She stood in place, not frozen, but grounded in the weight of everything that had unfolded. Her earlier certainty had been replaced with something more stable, more honest. Not confidence built on assumption, but awareness built on reflection. She glanced once toward the display, now dimmed but still present, then back toward Danielle. The audit will move forward, she said, her voice steady, no longer defensive, no longer searching for control. I will cooperate fully. The words were not dramatic. They were deliberate. Danielle nodded once, acknowledging the statement without softening the responsibility behind it. That is expected, she replied calmly. But cooperation is not the same as change. Karen absorbed that without resistance. Then I will demonstrate it, she said. The commitment was simple, but it carried weight because of everything that had led to it. Across the room, Richard stood again, this time not stepping into tension, but into alignment. Then it starts with leadership visibility, he said. Not just policy updates, but presence. Conversations. Real ones. Liam added quietly from his desk, and listening when people speak, even when it is uncomfortable. Danielle's gaze moved briefly toward him, acknowledging the point, because that was where change often failed. Not in policy, but in practice. The woman near the front who had spoken earlier leaned slightly against her desk, her voice steady. And we cannot wait for another moment like this to say something, she said. If we see it, we say it. The room did not react loudly, but the agreement was there.
Felt.
Understood. Danielle took a slow breath, then stepped forward just enough to bring the focus back without disrupting the balance that had formed. Her voice, when it came, was calm but firm, carrying a clarity that defined the moment without overpowering it. "What happened here will be documented," she said. "It will be reviewed. It will be discussed." She paused, briefly, letting that settle. "But what matters more is what cannot be documented." That drew attention again. Not confusion.
Focus.
"The decisions you make when no one is watching," she continued. "The assumptions you challenge before they turn into actions. The space you create for others to be seen before they have to prove themselves." The words moved through the room with a different kind of weight. Not immediate. Enduring. Karen listened closely, her posture steady, her expression no longer guarded but committed. "Then that becomes the standard," she said. Danielle met her gaze, holding it just long enough to make the expectation clear. "Not just for you," she replied. "For everyone." The statement widened the responsibility, placing it where it belonged. Across the entire room, Richard nodded. Liam straightened slightly. Others followed in small ways, not dramatic, but real. The shift was no longer centered on one person. It had become shared. Danielle stepped back again, allowing the room to settle into this new understanding. The tension had transformed fully now. What began as confrontation had become structure. Not rigid, not imposed, but understood. The system behind them continued its quiet process, finalizing reports, capturing data, ensuring accountability would not be forgotten. But Danielle knew something more important had already been set in motion. Something that did not rely on systems alone. She glanced around the office one last time, not searching, not measuring, just observing. The difference was there. In posture, in attention, in awareness. And that was where real change began. Not in what was written, in what was practiced. And now, there was no one in that room who could say they did not see it anymore. The office did not return to what it had been that morning, and it was never meant to. The hum of work resumed, but it carried a different rhythm now, one shaped by awareness instead of assumption. Danielle stood near the center of the floor for a moment longer, not because she needed to, but because she understood something most people in power often missed. Change does not happen when the moment ends. It happens in the quiet minutes that follow it. She watched as people settled back into their roles, but not into the same mindset. Screens lit up again, emails reopened, meetings resumed, but there was a pause in every action, a layer of thought that had not existed before. Karen walked slowly toward her desk, each step measured, not out of hesitation, but intention. She no longer moved like someone in control of a space. She moved like someone responsible for it. That difference was subtle, but it was real. Richard adjusted his chair and opened his laptop, but instead of diving into his usual workflow, he paused, his eyes reflecting a deeper focus. Liam sat down as well, but he did not immediately return to his tasks. He looked around the office once more, taking in the shift, understanding that what he had witnessed was not just a moment, but a standard being set in real time. Danielle finally turned slightly, her presence still steady, still grounded, but no longer confronting. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured, carrying the weight of everything that had been said without needing to repeat it. "What happened today was not about me," she said. The words moved through the room quietly, but everyone heard them. Conversations paused again, just briefly. Not out of tension this time, but attention. "It was about what you do when you think no one is watching," she continued. "And who you decide someone is before they ever get the chance to show you." Karen stopped walking for a second, those words landing differently now that she understood them. Not as critique, as truth. Danielle took a small step forward, not to reclaim space, but to leave something behind in it. "Titles do not create respect," she said. "They reveal whether it was there to begin with." No one moved. No one spoke, because that was the part that stayed. Not the reveal, not the authority, the lesson. The system behind them completed its final update, the audit now officially logged, the moment preserved in records that would not fade. But the real impact was not in the system. It was in the room. in the people who would carry this forward into decisions no one else would see. Danielle looked around one last time, not searching, not measuring, just confirming what she already knew. They understood now. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to begin. She turned toward the exit, her steps quiet, steady, the same way she had entered.
No announcement.
No need. The power she held had already done what it needed to do. Behind her, the office continued, but not as it had before. Conversations were more careful. Questions were asked sooner. Assumptions were slower to form. And in that shift, something important had changed. Not because someone was watching, but because now they were.